warm Friday afternoon in 1921, a woman named Maude Delmont walked into the Hall of Justice at 750 Kearny Street in San Francisco. She met with a police officer and filed a complaint. Her friend, Virginia Rappe, she said, had been the victim of a violent attack and sexual assault at the hands of one of the most famous movie stars in the world. Virginia Rappe was already dead. She had died 5 days earlier on September 9th at 25 years old. The cause of death was mysterious. She was engaged to be married, and she was buried at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. What would follow over the course of the next year would be 3 trials, countless tabloid headlines, and a movie industry shaken to the point where films for the next several decades were forced to live under the shadow of those proceedings. The man at the center of it all was Roscoe Arbuckle. The world called him Fatty, and before a single piece of evidence had been tested in a courtroom, the press had already decided what happened in that hotel room. They were almost certainly wrong. But it didn't matter. What the press did with Maude Delmont's complaint, and what Maude Delmont herself was actually doing when she walked through that door, is a story worth sitting for. Because the woman who filed that complaint, whose accusations set the entire machinery of prosecution in motion, was never once called to the witness stand in any of the 3 trials that followed. Not once. The woman who destroyed Roscoe Arbuckle never had to say a word under oath. And in the wreckage of it all, Hollywood built the system it still uses today to protect itself from scandal. Not to protect the people in the room, to protect the institution. I'm Lorne Bregetzer, a professor at the University of Colorado Denver's College of Arts and Media. And on Everything is Gray, we try to make sense of something that's rarely simple. How the artists we admire and the things they've done shape the way we see their work and ourselves. This is the story of the trial that changed Hollywood forever. And the 2 people at the center of it, one who lost everything and one whose name most people have never heard, deserve more than the headlines gave them. To understand how far Roscoe Arbuckle fell, you need to understand how high he was. I mean that in a way that's genuinely difficult to convey from the distance of a century. Born in 1887 in Smith Center, Kansas, which is, I should mention, as middle of America as a place can possibly be, Roscoe came into the world weighing over 13 pounds. His father, who was slim, decided the child couldn't possibly be his and named the baby after a politician he despised, Republican Senator Roscoe Conkling. His mother died when he was 12. His father, who had never shown much interest in him, stopped supporting him entirely. Roscoe started doing odd jobs at a hotel, and because this is the kind of origin story that feels invented but is not, a guest heard him singing while he worked, invited him to perform in an amateur talent show, and the rest is fairly straight line to Hollywood. What saved him was that he was genuinely, undeniably talented. Not just funny, though he was that, but versatile in a way that defied everything people assumed about a kid his size. He had a remarkable singing voice, good enough that professionals stopped to listen when he used it. He could dance, he could do acrobatics. He was doing pratfalls and physical comedy at an age when most teenagers are still figuring out how to walk through a doorway without hitting the frame. He was a genuine template for the late Chris Farley. By the time he was 16, he was a seasoned performer. Carnivals and vaudeville houses, traveling stock companies, doing a full act that combined jokes, songs, magic tricks, and physical stunts that left audiences genuinely baffled that a boy built the way he was could move the way he did. The nickname Fatty followed him everywhere, and he hated it. But the applause followed him too, and that he could work with. When Roscoe connected with director Mark Sennett's Keystone Studios in 1913, Arbuckle was already a veteran of vaudeville, carnivals, and traveling stock companies. What made him remarkable wasn't his size, it was what he could do despite it. He was genuinely acrobatic, he could dance. He took a pie to the face with the dignity of a man who had long since made peace with the universe. Buster Keaton, who was himself one of the greatest physical comedians who ever lived, called Arbuckle the funniest man alive, and Charlie Chaplin agreed. At Keystone, Arbuckle worked alongside, mentored, or discovered what amounts to a who's who of early comedy. Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, Mabel Normand. He later discovered Buster Keaton and personally brought Bob Hope into the business. The man had an eye. In 1920, Paramount Pictures had signed him for $1 million a year. In today's money, we're talking north of $16 million annually. He was, by any reasonable measure, untouchable. In the summer of 1921, Paramount head Adolf Zucker, a man who will be returning to with considerable suspicion, was pushing Arbuckle to film 3 movies simultaneously. He had already completed 2 and was midway through a third when Labor Day weekend arrived. He was exhausted. He had second-degree burns on his backside from sitting on an acid-soaked rag at a garage earlier that week. Zukor even asked him to skip the holiday entirely to attend an industry exhibitors convention. Arbuckle said no. He drove to San Francisco with 2 friends, Lowell Sherman and Fred Fishback, and they checked into 3 connecting suites at the St. Francis Hotel. Fishback had arranged everything, the rooms, the guests, the bootleg gin. Because this was 1921, and Prohibition was nominally the law, though nobody in Hollywood seemed particularly troubled by that. He was sitting on a rubber ring for the drive up because of those acid burns. I want you to hold on to that detail, because this is the version of events that nobody in the press bothered to lead with. Before we get to the party, let's talk about Virginia Rappe, because she deserves more than the role she's been assigned to in this story. She was born in Chicago in 1891 to a single mother who died when Virginia was 11, which gives her and Roscoe Arbuckle something in common that nobody ever seemed to notice. She was raised by her grandmother, moved to San Francisco as a young woman to work as a model, and eventually made her way to Los Angeles in the film industry. She had a real career, modest but genuine. She was named Best Dressed Girl in Pictures in 1918. She worked at Keystone, the same studio as Arbuckle. She designed clothes, she modeled, and she appeared in films. She was engaged to a director named Henry Lerman. She also had chronic cystitis, a bladder condition that had troubled her for years, and that was dramatically worsened by alcohol. Her doctor had specifically told her not to drink. Witnesses who knew her said that when she drank at parties despite this, she would become violently ill and tear at her clothing because the pressure on her bladder caused her excruciating pain. This is not a detail that emerged to exonerate Arbuckle. This is a detail that explains what happened to Virginia Rappe, independent of anything else. She arrived at the St. Francis on Labor Day 1921 with her publicist, Al Semnacher, and a woman named Bambina Maude Delmont. Rappe and Delmont had only met a few days earlier. Neither of them had been on the original guest list. The party at the St. Francis on September 5th was, by the standards of Prohibition-era Hollywood, not especially unusual. Bootleg gin, music, people from the fringes of the film industry, an atmosphere of people who were off the clock and intended to stay that way. Arbuckle was walking around in his pajamas and bathrobe. He was a guest in his own hotel suite, nursing burns on his backside, and it was a holiday weekend. That detail, the pajamas, would later be used against him in closing arguments. I'm not joking. 2 assistant district attorneys spent real court time making his loungewear sound sinister. At some point during the afternoon, Virginia Rappe became violently ill. She was found in one of the connecting rooms in severe pain, writhing on the bed, tearing at her clothes. Arbuckle said he heard her in the bathroom, helped her to a bed, and called for Maude Delmont and other guests to look after her. He then personally drove another party guest into town. The hotel doctor arrived. He concluded that Virginia Rappe was drunk. He administered morphine and left. She was not simply drunk. Her bladder had ruptured. It would be 3 days before anyone took her to a hospital. 3 days while she was in the kind of pain that a ruptured bladder creates. While a series of doctors cycled through and concluded she needed rest, while Maude Delmont, the woman who supposedly cared about her, managed the situation. On September 9th, Virginia Rappe died. Acute peritonitis. The infection that had spread from a ruptured bladder had simply had too much time. And Maude Delmont told police that Roscoe Arbuckle had raped her. Here is where the story becomes something else entirely, because Maude Delmont is a central figure in everything that happened next, and she never once testified in any of the 3 trials that followed. Hear that again. The woman whose accusation destroyed Arbuckle's life, the woman who set the entire machinery of prosecution in motion, was never put on the witness stand, not once across 3 separate trials. The prosecution knew exactly why she couldn't testify. San Francisco District Attorney Matthew Brady, described by people who knew him as arrogant, ruthless, and short-tempered, and who had very transparent ambitions to become governor of California. He discovered, upon investigating his star witness, that Maude Delmont had a criminal record containing over 50 counts of extortion, fraud, racketeering, and bigamy. She was also known in Los Angeles by a specific professional reputation. She had a scheme. She would bring attractive young women to parties attended by wealthy men. Those men would later find themselves accused of sexual assault. Maude Delmont would appear, at that point, to discuss how the situation might be resolved financially. She had done this many times. She had also, at the moment she claimed to have witnessed Arbuckle assault Virginia Rappe, been drunk and locked in a bathroom with another male party guest. Multiple witnesses confirmed she wasn't in the room, physically could not have seen what she said she saw. And then there were the telegrams. While Virginia Rappe was still alive in a hospital but still dying, Maude Delmont sent messages to attorneys in both San Diego and Los Angeles. The telegrams read, "We have Roscoe Arbuckle in a hole here. Chance to make some money out of him." That is not the behavior of a witness seeking justice. That is a woman running a scheme in writing while the person she claimed to be avenging was still breathing. Brady knew all of this. He prosecuted Arbuckle anyway. Because by the time any of this came out, it was already too late. William Randolph Hearst had done his work. The press. William Randolph Hearst was the most powerful media mogul in America. He was the owner of a national chain of newspapers that reached millions of readers daily, and that had, by 1921, already demonstrated a casual relationship with the truth when the truth wasn't sufficiently interesting. Think of him as an early 1900s Rupert Murdoch. Hearst had essentially invented the template for sensationalist tabloid journalism during the Spanish-American War, a conflict his papers helped inflame with stories that were, to put it charitably, embellished. He understood that outrage sold papers, that a villain the public could hate was worth more than a story the public could merely follow, and that a correction buried on page 12 does approximately nothing to undo a headline on page 1. Hearst reportedly said that the Arbuckle story sold more papers than the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania, the ship that killed 1,198 people and helped pull the United States into World War I, that Lusitania. Before Arbuckle had spoken a single word in his own defense, and before he even been formally charged, the headlines had tried and convicted him. Not just convicted him, they embellished him, progressively with each passing day. The story that initially circulated was that Arbuckle had used a piece of ice on Virginia Rappe. By the time it had traveled through the Hearst press, the ice became a Coca-Cola bottle, then a champagne bottle. The story mutated in real time, each version more lurid than the last. None of it sourced to anyone who had been in the room. None of it true. His films were pulled from theaters immediately. Not after a conviction, not after a finding of probable cause, immediately, in response to newspaper headlines. Meanwhile, Maude Delmont, the woman who was too compromised to testify, who had telegraphed her intentions to extort Arbuckle while Virginia Rappe was still dying, was touring the country giving public lectures on the moral corruption of Hollywood. Charging admission, she was giving speeches. The woman whose account was worthless in a courtroom was perfectly valuable on a stage, because in 1921, there was no mechanism to stop her. She was basically the Cato Kalin of the 1920s, but with worse hair. The presiding judge at the preliminary hearing, Sylvain Lazarus, noted in his own ruling, "I do not find any evidence that Mr. Arbuckle either committed or attempted to commit rape." He then went on to hold Arbuckle on trial on manslaughter charges anyway, explaining that they were really trying, and I quote, "our present-day morals, our present-day social conditions." Which is a remarkable thing for a judge to say. What he was acknowledging, essentially, was that Roscoe Arbuckle was being prosecuted for being famous at a moment when Hollywood's reputation needed a scapegoat. There were three separate trials. Let that sit for a moment. The first began in November 1921. Arbuckle took the stand. He was calm, direct, and consistent. He denied harming Virginia Rappe. He said he found her ill, helped her to a bed, and called for others to look after her. His estranged wife, Minta Durfee, showed up every single day to support him. The jury deliberated for nearly 44 hours and came back deadlocked, 10-2 in favor of acquittal, a mistrial. The second trial, early 1922, Arbuckle's defense team made a catastrophic tactical error. Overconfident, they didn't put him on the stand. They just read his prior testimony into the record. Never do that. The jury deadlocked again, this time 9-3, but in the other direction, toward conviction. Another mistrial. The third trial was in March 1922. By this point, Arbuckle had spent over $700,000 on his defense in 1922 dollars, the equivalent of roughly $13 million today. He was heading toward bankruptcy, he had sold his house and his cars. This time, his lawyers took the gloves off completely. They put Arbuckle on the stand again. They presented the medical evidence about Virginia Rappe's chronic cystitis, showing that her condition, worsened by alcohol, was entirely consistent with a spontaneous rupture independent of any assault. They called witnesses who had known Rappe for years, who described her history of becoming violently ill at parties when she drank. They demonstrated that the district attorney had intimidated witnesses, several of whom admitted under cross-examination that Brady had threatened to charge them with perjury if they didn't testify against Arbuckle. And they spent considerable time on Maude Delmont. Defense attorney Gavin McNabb described her in his closing as the complaining witness who never witnessed, which is, I have to say, an excellent line. The jury deliberated for 6 minutes. 6 minutes. 5 of those minutes were spent drafting a statement. It read in part, "Acquittal is not enough for Roscoe Arbuckle. We feel that a great injustice has been done him. We feel also that it is our only plain duty to give him this exoneration, under the evidence, for there was not the slightest proof adduced to connect him to any way with the commission of a crime. We wish him success, and hope that the American people will take the judgment of 14 men and women that Roscoe Arbuckle is entirely innocent and free from all blame." A jury apology. In American legal history, that is essentially unprecedented. He kept the letter for the rest of his life. What happened to Roscoe? He was completely acquitted, with a jury apology. 6 days later, Will Hays banned him from the movies anyway. Will Hays was the newly appointed head of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, a body the studios had created in 1922 specifically in response to the Arbuckle scandal and several other simultaneous Hollywood controversies. Hays was the former Postmaster General under Warren Harding, a Presbyterian elder from Indiana, essentially the most wholesome-looking human being the studios could find on short notice. His job was to make Hollywood look like it had a conscience. Hays needed to demonstrate he was serious, so he made Roscoe Arbuckle his demonstration. A man who had just been acquitted with a jury apology was banned from the industry that made him its biggest star. Here's where it gets interesting. It later came out that Adolph Zukor, Arbuckle's own boss at Paramount, the man who had pushed him into filming 3 movies simultaneously that summer, the man who had wanted him at an exhibitors convention instead of San Francisco, had made a mysterious payment to the district attorney Matthew Brady on the first day of the first trial. I'm not going to tell you what that means, I'm just telling you that it happened. Hays lifted the ban within the year, but it didn't matter much. The industry had moved on. Exhibitors still wouldn't show his films. Several of his features, including a completed Paramount picture called Leap Year, were simply never released in the United States because of the scandal. Some of his films from this period no longer exist at all. Buster Keaton quietly kept him employed, hiring him to direct under the pseudonym William Goodrich, a name inspired by Keaton's suggestion that Roscoe use "will be good." Chaplin did the same. Under that pseudonym, Arbuckle directed 51 short films through the 1920s. An actress named Louise Brooks, who worked with him in 1931, later wrote, "He made no attempt to direct his picture. He just sat in his director's chair like a dead man. He had been very nice and sweetly dead ever since the scandal that ruined his career." Sweetly dead, that phrase has stayed with me. In 1932, a letter-writing campaign from his friends in the industry finally helped him secure a contract with Warner Brothers to star, under his own name for the first time in years, in a series of short comedies. They were successful. The public, it turned out, was ready to welcome him back. Warner Brothers signed him for a feature film. On June 29, 1933, Arbuckle finished filming the last of his shorts. The next day, Warner Brothers signed him for the feature. He reportedly told his wife, "This is the best day of my life." Later that night, he suffered a heart attack in his sleep. He was 46. Those who knew him said it was a broken heart that had been doing the real work for years, and that the heart attack simply finished it. The people who actually knew Roscoe Arbuckle told a remarkably consistent story about him. His first wife, Minta Durfee, even after their divorce, called him the most generous human being I've ever met, and said if she had to do it over again, she'd marry the same man. Charlie Chaplin described him as a genial, easygoing type who would not harm a fly. Those weren't carefully worded statements designed to help a friend in legal trouble. He was the kind of man who, while doing a nightclub circuit in Cleveland, struck up a conversation with a young stand-up comedian who was struggling to find his footing. He spent time with the kid, encouraged him, and then handed him letters of recommendation to take to his own agent in Hollywood. That young comedian was Bob Hope. Almost any hard luck story was good for $10 from Roscoe, and frequently considerably more. Money came easily to him and left the same way, and he never seemed particularly troubled by the distinction. The nickname he'd carried since childhood, Fatty, he hated with a quiet consistency his whole life, but he never once turned away someone who needed help. Those two things together tell you something about the man the headlines never did. How it changed everything. This is where the story stops being about one man and starts being about all of us. Because the machinery that was built in response to the Arbuckle scandal didn't go away when Roscoe died. It had become the template. By 1921, legislators in 37 states had introduced nearly 100 film censorship bills. The studios were facing a genuine existential threat: comply with hundreds of inconsistent local decency laws, or find another way, so they found another way. By 1922, the major studios formed the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America and handed the reins to Will Hays. The goal was self-regulation, which sounds principled, and is, in the way that any alternative to a worse outcome sounds principled. The Hays Code, formerly the Motion Picture Production Code, was adopted in 1930 and fully enforced from 1934 to 1968. It dictated what American cinema could and couldn't show. No profanity, no drug use, no interracial relationships, no homosexuality, even implied. Crime had to be punished and evil had to lose. The censor didn't sit in a government office anymore. The studios had invited him in and set him up with a desk and a staff and the power to demand script changes before a single frame was shot. Decades of American cinema, its stories, its silences, its entire moral vocabulary were shaped by a panic that started with a woman who was never called to testify about something she didn't witness. Think about what got lost. Stories about gay and lesbian lives, interracial love stories, films where the villain wins, where the world is complicated, where morality is gray rather than black and white. The Hays Code didn't rescue cinema from corruption. It taught Hollywood to flinch systematically for 34 years. And it established something more durable than any list of rules. It established a principle: when scandal threatens the industry manages the scandal. It sacrifices an individual to protect the institution. It performs concern about morality as a strategy for avoiding accountability. This is still how it works, and the examples aren't hard to find. When Harvey Weinstein's behavior was finally reported by the New York Times and the New Yorker in 2017, the response from studio heads and producers that had worked alongside him for decades was uniform and immediate. There was shock, condemnation, and a very careful insistence that nobody had known. Nobody. At a company where assistants screened his hotel room arrangements and NDAs were standard practice. The industry didn't protect the women Weinstein abused. It protected itself from being associated with him once protecting him was no longer viable. Kevin Spacey. The moment the accusations became public, Netflix pulled him from House of Cards and digitally removed him from the film All the Money in the World. Not because the industry had suddenly developed a conscience, but because association with him had become a liability. The concern was reputational, not moral, and there's a difference. Roman Polanski pleaded guilty in 1977 to the statutory rape of a 13-year-old girl. He fled the country before sentencing and continued to make films and receive standing ovations at European festivals and nominations at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. The same organization that eventually expelled him in 2018, 41 years later, when the cultural moment made continued association with him uncomfortable. Not when the crime occurred, not when he fled, but when it became bad for business. And perhaps most telling, the morals clauses that were written into studio contracts in the wake of the Arbuckle scandal, the ones designed to give studios the power to terminate anyone who brought disrepute to the industry, were wielded for decades not to protect people from predators, but to fire gay and lesbian actors whose private lives, if exposed, might embarrass the studio. The clause, built to look like a moral standard, was used as a tool of control, which is exactly what it was designed to be. The names change, but the mechanism doesn't. And now, I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where it's tempting to oversimplify in one direction or the other. The Arbuckle case is often cited correctly as a textbook example of a man destroyed by a media circus, a politically ambitious prosecutor, and a witness who was running a scheme. That's true. 14 jurors said so in 6 minutes and then wrote him an apology. But here's what I keep coming back to. Roscoe Arbuckle was acquitted. His reputation was eventually partially restored. He had Buster Keaton, he had Chaplin, he had a letter he kept for the rest of his life that said the jury was sorry. Virginia Rappe had nothing. She died, and then in the process of defending Roscoe Arbuckle, which to be clear may have well been the right outcome, her reputation was systematically dismantled in open court. She was called promiscuous, an alcoholic, diseased. Witnesses testified about her previous relationships, her medical history, her behavior at parties. There were no protections for her. She was dead, so she couldn't object. The defense used everything available because everything was available on the table in 1921. There were no rape shield laws. There were no protections for the character of a deceased victim. There was no mechanism to distinguish between her medical history explains what happened to her and let's make sure the jury thinks she deserved it. Both arguments were made, sometimes simultaneously. Then there's the question that nobody in the press asked, which is, what was Maude Delmont's actual relationship to Virginia Rappe? Delmont was, by multiple accounts, someone who brought young women to parties attended by wealthy men. Virginia Rappe arrived at the St. Francis with Delmont and had only met her days earlier. In a story full of people who don't quite add up, Delmont is the one who makes me most uneasy. Not because I think she orchestrated Virginia Rappe's death, I don't think that. But because in the rush to establish Delmont as a fraud and an extortionist, the question of what she was doing at that party with a woman she just met went largely unexamined. And I don't know what the answer is, and I'm not sure anyone does. What I know is this: Virginia Rappe's death was real. Her suffering in that hotel room and in the hospital over 4 days was real. Whatever happened, and the honest answer is that we genuinely don't know what exactly happened in room 1219. A young woman died badly and without adequate care and in circumstances that nobody in power had a particular incentive to fully understand. The district attorney needed a conviction. The defense needed an acquittal. The press needed a story, and the studios needed a scapegoat. Virginia Rappe needed a doctor 4 days earlier and didn't get one. When Harvey Weinstein's behavior was finally made public in 2017, the industry's response wasn't shocked that it happened. Weinstein had operated for decades inside an industry that had spent a century perfecting the art of managing exactly this kind of situation. The Hays Code didn't protect women in Hollywood. It protected the studios from scrutiny. Those are not the same thing. The distance between them is where a lot of people have gotten lost. The morals clauses that became standard in Hollywood contracts after the Arbuckle scandal, those clauses that gave studios the power to terminate a contract if an actor's behavior brought disrepute to the industry, were not designed to make Hollywood safer. They were designed to give studios leverage over actors, over directors, over anyone who might become inconvenient. They made it easier to fire people when they became problems, and harder to protect people when they needed protection. The institution comes first. That was the lesson of 1922, and it has not been unlearned. Can we separate the injustice done to Roscoe Arbuckle from the injustice done to Virginia Rappe? Can we hold both simultaneously? That he was almost certainly not guilty of what he was charged with, and that the system that acquitted him left her with no dignity and no justice, and then built itself a new set of tools that protected the industry rather than the people inside it? Those are the questions we ask on Everything is Gray, because nothing about the story, not the party, not the trials, not what came after, is simple. The end of the story. Roscoe Arbuckle is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. His grave was, for a long time, unmarked. His wife had his body cremated, per his wishes, and his ashes were interred without a headstone. A marker was eventually added. Virginia Rappe is buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, alongside her fiancé Henry Lerman, whom she never got to marry. Maude Delmont died in 1960. She was, by most accounts, still married to several men simultaneously. Matthew Brady, the district attorney who prosecuted Arbuckle 3 times on the testimony of a witness he knew was lying, who intimidated other witnesses into false testimony, who accepted a payment from Adolph Zukor on the first day of the first trial, never became governor of California. He ran twice and lost both times. Adolph Zukor lived to be 103. He died in 1976, having never been asked publicly, as far as I could find, about that payment. Will Hayes ran the MPPDA until 1945. The code that bears his name lasted until 1968, when it was replaced by the rating system that we still use today. The infrastructure he built, self-regulation as a shield against accountability, is still a basic operating principle of the industry. And Roscoe Arbuckle, a man who discovered Buster Keaton, who mentored Charlie Chaplin, who invented physical comedy for the screen, who was the first entertainer to be paid $1 million a year, is remembered primarily for a crime he almost certainly didn't commit, at a party he didn't organize, in a hotel room he checked into because his boss wouldn't let him rest. The best day of his life was the day he died. I'm Lauren with Everything is Gray. Thanks for listening. This episode is dedicated to Virginia Rappe and everyone whose story has been told by someone else for someone else's purposes. This podcast has been produced, written, and edited by Lauren Brigitzer.